Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the changes that Nobuko Yoshida suggested that we make to the paper that we are submitting to Places 2020. In particular, she asked me to supply an example of the calculation of the translation. And since that's so illustrative of what's going on, I thought it would be useful to go through that in detail. Is that okay with everyone?
Oh,
Sounds good.
All right. Pardon me, I'm trying to have a little breakfast while we talk. But I'm going to screen share. And so here's the revised draft, which you can also get from GitHub. And essentially what we're doing is, in the example, which is a very common sort of paradigm in the pi calculus, you're listening for, oh, whoops, there's a typo right there. Let me fix that real quick. So that's done. Glad I did this. Okay, all right, so here's a standard pi calculus process. So we're listening for something on X, whatever we get will be bound to Y, and then we stop. And that's running in parallel with oops, am I still there? You guys hear me?
Yes, we used to hear you.
Okay, cool. All right, so so on X we're going to send something, and then that something is a fresh something. It's a brand new. It's a new bound name. So the way this would work, if you were going to execute this in pi, well, the first thing you'd have to do is you'd have to extrude the new scope. So you'd have to push this for comprehension under the new scope, and that works because new is not binding the X here. So you can do that, and then once you've done that, then there's a rule in the pi calculus that says if p goes to p prime, then new of p, new u p goes to new u p prime. So you can kind of ignore the new and descend into the scope, and then you just have a for comprehension in parallel, waiting on X in parallel with something that's outputting on X. And that will send the X over, and then we would substitute the U in for every occurrence in 0, and that's just 0. So that's the way that would evolve. So let's see how that works in the Yoshida translation. So here's the Yoshida translation. We split the translation over the par, and then this for comprehension becomes a translation in terms of her sort of fancy for, and then that just becomes a K of X, and then there's the translation of the new part that you just push it through the new, and then you translate the output, and that's just the output. So it's just K of X, new U, MU, MXU. And again, in order to evaluate this, you would have to extrude the new scope over the K, which you can do because it's not binding the X. And then you have a message together with a kill, and the kill just kills the message, so you go to 0. So it's very similar to the execution in the original process. So now let's see, but notice that it's using the new, right? We're still making essential use of the new. So now let's translate that into the row calculus. So we take the output of her translation and run it here. So again, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to split it over the par. And this thing just goes to the K of X. And then the new turns into a for comprehension, which is right here. So new becomes a 4, and essentially all we're doing is we're sending the fresh name down the channel P, and then we're going to wait for P on P for that fresh name. So that's essentially what we're doing, and then we translate the body inside. So what we're going to do is we're in flipping it around. We translate the body inside using these parameters. And then that's guarded by a 4 comprehension. So we're going to translate that 4 comprehension using basically the techniques of Yoshida. And then whatever result of that is, that'll be run in parallel with sending N along P. So the nice thing is we can just calculate. We don't have to do any guessing or any fancy footwork. So we just calculate. So the 4 comprehension. The message part is just going to be what it is, message, and this thing becomes a 4 waiting on the PR, which is the parameter here, so then we translate all of that under getting rid of this 4. So that's what all of these equations are doing. And in particular, this one says that if you have a message, then it becomes a forwarder. So a message from V to X will become a forwarder from P to V. Right? So if we get something along P, and whatever that thing is X, and we're just going to forward that along from P to V. So that's the general idea. So this thing here becomes that forwarder, right? So it's a PR, but in this case, this is playing the role of V, right? So from PR to X. And now let's see what happens if I were to run this in parallel with this. Well, forwarding from PR to X in parallel with a message sending something on PR is just a message of that thing on X. So this thing would evolve to M, X, N, R, and K, X, MX just goes to 0. So that's exactly what we expect. It does exactly the same thing that this does, except for the scope extrusion. And this is where things get interesting. The scope extrusion, the step of extruding the scope, corresponds precisely to this forwarding step. And that's exactly what would happen in implementation. When you implement scope extrusion, you're basically expanding the possible message sets, or the possible namespace, not the message sets. And in particular, you might need to forward, something that was sitting at an old name to something that's sitting at, the name that's actually being used. And that's exactly what happens here. So it's rather cool that the scope extrusion is directly and explicitly modeled. And this is close to what Lozis does when he recovers there's a theorem that so in the Hennessy-Milner logic, so you have a nice theorem that's of the form P and Q are bisimilar if and only if they satisfy all the same formulae. Now you sacrifice that in spatial logic, because spatial logic has X-ray vision. It can see when a process is made up of pars, which Hennessy-Milner logic can't see. And to recover that correspondence between bisimulation and spatial logic formulae, you have to explicitly account for all of the operations of the par. So parse associatives. So you'll have to account for all those steps. And similarly, you have to account for the scope extrusion. And so that's the kind of thing to get that sort of fine-grained, detailed correspondence between what you can see with formulae and what you can see with biosimulation. You essentially have to implement these kinds of more fine-grained manipulations, like what we're doing here. So essentially, it's unveiling the implementation of new. That new is going to have to behave in a particular way, and that's sort of what this step is. And when you go to the proof of the biosimulation or the faithfulness of the translation, a lot of that comes out in the wash because you can't see the action at PR. That gets hidden by the biosimulation steps. From the biosimulation, it becomes a kind of hidden action, which is exactly what you want, right? The actions along any actions that might correspond to the implementation of new should be hidden from view. So that's how that shakes out. Any questions on that?
I'm not sure that I understand why it's necessary to do this step to remove a new part.
Sorry, I'm chewing. So we're interested in having a computational calculus that has no nominal phenomena whatsoever. So that's kind of been a goal, is to get rid of new and abstraction.
I see.
Right. So Honda and Yoshida got rid of abstraction, and in some sense, what they're doing is very, very similar to what was done with the SKI. So with SKI, you can get rid of lambda abstraction. All right, and so their approach is super, super similar to that, or we could say it's inspired by that. But they still make heavy use of the new operator. So they don't get rid of that. With Meredith and Rodestock, so in the original row calculus papers, we get rid of the new and we leave the abstraction alone. So there's kind of two pieces, right? One is getting rid of abstraction, the other is getting rid of the new operator. And you can combine them. And what this paper does is to say, not only that you can combine them, but here's how they combine, and when you combine them, you get something that's faithful to the original.
I see.
Yeah.
So you're using 4 to remove new.
Eventually, we use 4 to remove new, and then we remove 4.
Oh, I see.
So you go the way you remove new is you treat it as 4 together with sending something that nobody could ever see.
Okay, this is what I understand.
Yeah, so that's how we get rid of new, and then getting rid of 4 is just the usual SKI stuff. You're just distributing the names to the right places.
Okay, this makes sense. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So that's I think this is very illustrative of the kind of thing that I mean, to me, this is what I like. I want to be able to calculate rather than to guess. And you can treat these equations as the unfolding of a compiler. So if you handed me a pi calculus process, I could compile it down to combinators that never mentioned either new or 4. just combinators plus
Mm,
parallel composition. Uh,
yeah.
so, and then the one of the things that you can learn from this is how much compression you get from both of those. So what you'll find is that you get a combinatorial explosion. So in this particular example, you don't have huge growth. But in other examples where you have a lot of nested for comprehensions, you get pretty hefty growth. So in particular, abstraction, the input guarded abstraction is giving you a lot for free in terms of program compression, and so that's really a useful thing to know. So faithful. So execution models, which are entirely combinatorial in nature, will be less efficient in the long run than things that have a native representation of abstraction. And then since new is implemented in terms of abstraction, you get exactly the same issue. If you don't have some kind of analog in your execution model to abstraction, then you're going to get this massive blow up, which is really really interesting, I think. And it coincides with what we saw with Miranda, the implementation, the evolution of the implementation of Miranda and OCaml. Or OCaml started off as Camel, which was the categorical abstract machine. And if memory serves, I mean, certainly it's the case in Miranda where David Turner gets rid of all of the abstraction and just uses the combinators, and then he introduces, because he observes this explosion, this combinatorial explosion, he introduces this idea of super combinators to try to get Miranda to be efficient. And a similar kind of evolution happens with OCaml until finally their execution model, kind of leaves behind a combinator representation and picks up a representation that has a notion of abstraction more natively. It keeps an environment around, basically. So keeping an environment around is, which is essentially what you have to do to mimic abstraction, is a really important thing. It's if you want. So the trade-off of the space explosion in an environment is much smaller than the space explosion that you get from the, a desugaring abstraction. So it's a kind of halfway house, halfway point for those kinds of execution models. So it's really, and we get to see all this when we have these kind of nice, crisp equational presentations, which is what I've been arguing for. If you want to be able to actually give good both theoretical and practical analysis, then you have to, your models have to be grounded. I mean, the thing that's interesting about the row calculus and the row combinators is that they're grounded in a way that neither the pi calculus nor the lambda calculus are grounded. Right. I mean, if you're really, really pedantic about the row calculus, everything starts from zero.
Yeah.
Right. There's no names other than what you generate by process expressions generated from zero. And that is, so row calculus code actually looks like machine code. Yeah. So this grounding is what gives you something that's super, super close to implementation. And like all of the things that we know from implementations of pi calculus-like things, like the allocation of memory and things like that, they're all accounted for in the row calculus in a way that they're not accounted for in the pi calculus. They're only implied. And similarly, with this example here, we're seeing something that's that corresponds to this. The fact that the grounding of the calculus makes it super, super close to what we would do to implement it. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's all I got for today. I do think it's of interest and of value. Would like to advertise the paper. Please go check it out in GitHub. I think Nabucco's comments have made it considerably better paper. So we're grateful. Mike and I are very grateful to her input and guidance. And yeah, hope that it will be accepted for publication.
Oh yeah. You said you submitted for some conference in Ireland, or
it will be submitted.
Sure.
We're still kind of going through the process, right? And if
Cool.
as soon as Nabucco says, "Okay, I'm finished making comments," then it will be submitted. But it's just, yeah.
So if it's going to be accepted, you will be presenting this on this conference?
With luck, yes, with luck. I would certainly love to.
Nice.
I'm not sure what the weather would be like in Ireland in April. I have a feeling it might not be the sunniest of places, but I don't know.
But it's pretty close to me, so yeah. Yeah, cool.
All right. Well, thank you all. I wish you a pleasant morning, and see some of you at Stand Up.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks. Bye-bye.